and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. For years now, Malaysia has relied on the B40, M40 and T20 income classifications to shape policies and to understand the nation's economic strata. But recent debate sparked in Budget 2025 when they made reference to the T15, which is said to be the wealthiest segment of the Malaysian population, has exposed fault lines in our framework of economic stratification. A recent working paper by Khazanah Research Institute titled Searching for the Poor and the Middle Class in Malaysia challenges the very foundations of these categories and proposes some new classifications to better reflect the economic reality of Malaysians. So if the middle class isn't what we thought it was, what does that mean for subsidy rationalisation and other targeted benefits? So joining me on the show to discuss this further are the authors of the working paper, Dr Suraya Ismail, Director of Khazanah Research Institute, and Gregory who is the Research Associate at KRI. So thank you so much for being on the show. What a fascinating paper that you have put out. And I want to, before we get into the income demarcations, I want to focus on a central argument of the report, which is the importance of a robust middle class. Let's talk a little bit about that. Why is it important to have a robust middle class in the country? And maybe then after that we can go into understanding what it means to be middle class. Dr. Suraya.
Thank you, Melisa, and thank you for offering us the time to speak about our working paper. It's fascinating how it has gotten a lot of traction with people, because I suppose it resolute with people more, especially now with the cost of living spiraling high. To your question, why are we talking about the middle class? Before we go for the working definition, what is the middle class? All around the world, a lot of countries are trying to strengthen their middle class because these are the group of households that are strong financially. They are the ones that push aggregate demand. They are the ones who demand sophisticated goods and services. Therefore, they push the aggregate demand of the economy. Therefore, they gives the growth of consumption, G equals, yes, the national growth, by pushing C, consumption. So if you have a strong middle class, you can really push the economy. That's number one. Politically, it's very important to have a strong middle class because it gives the aspiration of social mobility. So the not so middle class, or those who strive to want to have a good life, the good life, would want to see that, hey, I've got a strong middle class, I too can be there. So this is why politically it's also very important to understand the characteristics and to show that a country can create a middle class, be it with a growth of cities, be it with manufacturing, or be it with services, that whatever the government does, it can propel and create a strong middle class.
Okay. All right, so that's why it's important, and we hear a lot about the vanishing or the disappearing middle class, right, around the world. But when we think about Malaysia and the middle class in Malaysia, what do we think it to be versus what is the reality, Greg?
So when we started doing this report, we were looking for a Malaysian definition of middle class, but unfortunately, we do not really do studies about what it means to be middle class here in Malaysia. So we have looked in developed countries. And in developed countries, what it means to be middle class is that one is able to insulate oneself from adverse financial situations. You exhibit aspirational spending in that you can invest in your own social mobility. So for example, you're able to free up your time by hiring other people to do the things that you don't want to do, and then you can study and you can develop skills. There are other examples for which the middle class population also purchase signaling goods that signal their class, like paintings and plants, etc., etc. Yeah, so these were the characteristics that we were looking for in the way Malaysians spend their money. And by looking at these characteristics, that is how we identify the middle class.
Okay, so let's talk about the current B40, M40, T20 framework that has long been used. Why do these categories fail to capture Malaysians' economic reality in terms of expenditure? Because you used an expenditure space model.
That's
So
right.
talk to me about how that model captures household realities.
Okay, maybe before I go into that, it's useful to point out that this B40 and M40 T20 categories came from Robert McNamara in the World Bank in the 1970s. And back then in the past, it is true that the bottom 40% of households worldwide were suffering from malnutrition, squalor, and all sorts of deprivations. But certainly many years have passed, and it is no longer the case where 40% of our households are poor. So when we embarked on this research, we said, instead of just looking at income as a means to sort of like determine how households from B40, M40, T20, let's look at how they spend, with the amount of money that they earn, what can they spend their money to buy, the functionings and the capabilities that these households have. So that is when we created this expenditure space model to look exactly at the spending patterns of households at all different income levels. And based on these spending patterns, we observed that actually if you're only looking for households that who exhibit basic needs characteristics, in that they are only able to live from hand to mouth, and these are the basic stuff that you can buy. It's the B20 households that is of that in Malaysia that have these characteristics. On the other hand, if it's middle class, it is more concentrated to T30. Now, what about households in the middle? Households in the middle, they are having this trade-off between basic and aspirational. Some households are starting to develop aspirational traits, but they are not. It's not a lot, and it's things like sending your kids to tuition, buying more furniture for your house. It's stuff like even eating out and having fried chicken, for example.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, that middle bracket that you talk about, the M50, they are far more economically vulnerable than we once thought they were. That they have to trade off between, things that are necessities versus things that are aspirational. So that's not middle class behavior.
No.
It's not. Okay, how do I make sense of that, Dr. Suraya?
So I think the thing about this classification is that, as you know, when we want to classify things, they must demonstrate certain group characteristics. So when we say so let's compare that with the previous one that everybody thought that was right, but that's just using income, right? That was just having, hey, one line B40, one line and for T20. So that's just income. So then currently it's being used to compare B40 of Uganda versus B40 of Finland. That for comparison. So currently, what we are trying to do is different, where we add consumption. So that's how we can get middle class or middle income. So now, the ones M50 based on expenditure, they are exhibiting trade-offs. These trade-offs does not make them eligible for the middle class category. So if one were to make sense of it, then one must understand that this is an integrated approach. Look at income, disposable income now, because basically you have to take a disposable income for expenditure.
Right.
And what are the things you consume? So if you don't consume for that you can absorb financial shocks. For example, there was one household that we saw, right? If you had more money, the expenditure is going to buy KFC ini before Gaza lah, right? Or if you two of your tires pecah, you can't go back to balik kampung. So that was in that middle 40, middle income. So how do we make sense of it? We look at that sort of granular data. So these are not the middle class.
Okay, let's talk about who does exhibit middle class spending behavior, the
Thirty.
Okay. T20, that T20 category, has long been a shorthand for us to use to refer to
the rich,
affluent, the wealthy, atas, orang kaya. It's a shorthand for many Malaysians. So talk to me about the complexities in establishing what constitutes affluence then, Greg.
Well, here's the deal. I think it is very difficult to determine affluence, and certainly that is also outside the scope of our research because we only look at
income
and expenditure. In order to determine affluence, I think one would have to look at assets.
Okay, so you bring in another category. Okay.
Yes.
No, but that's the point, right? For this report, right? Why on earth are people equating T20 to the rich when it's just based on income? So that's a mess. That's like a what? Why did we do this? It was not right to begin with to equate all these categories just based on income. And mind you, this income is relative. So it's just comparing one group to the other. It's not absolute. And that's one. Number two, it doesn't have assets. So to begin with, why did we say they are rich?
Yeah, so it doesn't include assets or debt. So interesting because it's just a measure of how poor are you compared to someone else, and how rich are you compared. So it's not you are rich, but you are richer relative to someone else.
Yes. Exactly. Can you imagine if you're in Finland, your B40 is maybe our, B40 is starting with say 5,000 euros. I mean, that's not poor. You can't equate the B40, that's poor. Okay. So the way we think about distribution is salah.
Okay, all right. And that's worrying when it's been implemented into policy for so many years. I mean, it's been decades that we've been using this, right? Let's take a contemporary example. Subsidy rationalisation. If T30 behaves like the middle class, then who should be eligible for petrol subsidies and who should not? Who should be excluded?
So if we understand the usefulness of this demarcation or a relative measure of household, it's about looking at who's richer, quote unquote, and who's poorer. Therefore, it's a macro distribution. So I'll not go for subsidy. I'll just give an example of taxes.
Okay.
I'm sorry to do this. If, for example, you say that taxes should be decided by a distribution, that's a bit outrageous, isn't it? You must isi borang, you must know, okay, my taxes is based on household, not isteri atau suami. It's based on household. So I isi borang macam tu. And that's how I get taxes being taxed on me or any aid or benefit. So you can't use a distribution to then say this is how the final arbiter of how you get aid or you don't get aid, you get tax or you don't get tax, because it's just a line, and this line is meant to show relative. It's not absolute.
Greg, what do you think?
I completely agree. So certainly the distribution gives a broad overview of how spending patterns are like, but certainly the distribution itself cannot be the sole arbiter of how you want to, who gets subsidies and who doesn't get subsidies.
Okay. That's a tough one then.
You have to be a little bit more complex with your approach, in that you need to consider so many other things. And if that is the case, I envision a world in which sometimes it could be T1, sometimes it could be T5, sometimes T30, sometimes T15. I think governments have to make difficult decisions with regards to the outcome of interest that they're trying to achieve, and it's not T15 all the time, in my opinion.
Right. So when policymakers think like that, and I think this is where, if we use that distribution method and we think about how policy has been implemented in Malaysia, you pointed in your working paper about the benefits cliff. So that's interesting, because that's where I think a lot of people are concerned and worried about the fact that if as a household that's just above that eligibility criteria, then they might face disproportionate loss of benefits. That also may impact social mobility. And I am curious to learn more about that, Dr. Suraya.
the thing about, also we use an example in our views article to say that if someone was eligible for a PPR housing, suddenly his or her income went up the threshold of eligibility for PPR housing. But that increase in income is not big enough to then get a house or a rental of a house equal to what they have in PPR, because rental is so expensive outside. So this is what we call, whatever you get more sometimes is worse off than what you're going to get once you're out of the system. So we always feel that that's why you know, we have Jabatan Kebajikan, we have all these other NGOs working with the poor, and how we can create an ecosystem that is good for them. And that is also the case when we look at individual cases. So that is at the scale of families, but this is at the scale of national scale. So the usefulness of having a distribution analysis that you can plan in terms of resources, you can agak-agak lah. So how many people might use it, you can plan for it. But the actual looking at the case would be at the individual level. So that's what we're trying to say. And that household about that going into a bracket that is not eligible anymore for any social benefit or social welfare benefits. This means that it's not just about income, it's the ecosystem of, say, housing, it's the ecosystem of wages, education, because you can't simply be out of everything, because as Greg was saying, it's a lot of deprivations, it's not just one.
Okay, what does that mean, Greg, then, if we think about all the findings from the working paper and translating that into policy, into interventions that actually might hit the mark?
So I think one of the ways that this methodology can be used is actually to simulate policy interventions. So let's say you're interested in making some change that relates to a certain product. Then one is able to simulate how many households are going to be harmed by that policy, how many households would gain from that policy, and that is sort of like a balanced approach for you to find at which threshold does this make sense and at what quantum.
Can I ask you specifically about the M50? Because I'm curious about this almost invisible group of the population in terms of economic or social protections, because they don't qualify for social protections, but they're also economically vulnerable, and there's a fragility to the way they handle their household expenses. What policy interventions would specifically help the M50 that may be different from helping the B20 and the T30? Dr. Suraya, would you like to weigh?
Yes, I think one of the most interesting things, before I go there, is looking at, okay, before we say the middle class, policy dahulu, middle class starts at M40. And then T20. So meaning we have a middle class or aspirational class or very strong households of 60%. Right?
That will drive domestic consumption. Yes.
So now with this new classification, we are saying 70% are vulnerable, which is the M50 plus the B20. And then 30% is strong. But this strong pun ada gradients of strength, right? The 71 is not as great as 81. There are gradients there too. They might need help too. Because they show, because when we do lines, as the math genius would tell us, it's not just a line, it's brackets. Sometimes it's a range. So then kita buat iteration banyak kali, and then okay, that's the line that we are comfortable with. People can challenge us, that's fine. Okay. So when you have a B70, that means 20 orang kata memang kena tolong everything. Now, M50 means that we have to rethink juga whether we should privatize health. Can they afford insurance? Because remember, the middle class are the ones who can pay for private insurance, not the M50. So in terms of numbers, can it be sustained that you want to take out the government funding from health? Yes. So this is the use of understanding where we are at the national level.
These are the questions that we need to ask almost every sector.
Yes,
now.
Yes. So when they say that, because it informs public debate. It informs public debate, not just at the policy level, but also in the media, in other think tanks, in universities, or any informed or relevant stakeholders, which is the general public. For example, now, they were saying that M40, dulu lah, M40, the anak-anak should masuk university should pay for full fees. Now that we know the demarcation is like that, is that right? But there are caveats to this work, meaning for 10 years, Greg has done it. Greg has done this for 4 sets of HIES.
Yep.
This is the demarcation. Now, say for example, from 2022 up until 2030, a different demarcation comes out. So, tukarlah policy. So, continuously improving our policy.
I see. So, it will have to reflect the data. Greg, can I ask you? So, Dr. Suraya mentioned that you've been working on this for a while. This data that you are using, if I'm not mistaken, is from 2009 to 2019.
That's right.
Given that so much has happened in the intervening period, we've gone through a pandemic.
That's right.
2 more.
Could that impact or change the current reality today? Could there be a gap between the data back then and today's reality?
The honest answer is that I do not know. It could potentially be different, and we will only know once we have run the analysis again. Okay. But looking at the data between 2009 and 2019, there seems, these classifications seem to have some form of stability. The products that were once classified as basic needs continue to be classified as basic needs throughout the years, and what is aspirational is aspirational. Okay. However,
so the categories may not change that much?
Yes, okay. Although the movement, the expansion or the shrinkage of those we consider middle class, that might move
there could be a slight movement in the different bands.
Yes, so it isn't about B20, M50 and T30 per se. It's, in my opinion, it's more about how many households are basic needs and how many households are middle class. And that is actually the question, the metrics that we would look at as an indicator of development. All developed countries want this, right? Yeah. You want to reduce the amount of households under poverty, but at the same time, you also want a very, very strong middle class.
Do you think that this approach, while novel and very innovative and important, could be complex and difficult to grasp by policymakers, especially given how entrenched the use of B40 and 40 T20 has been in Malaysia?
Certainly it's tough. In the past 5 years itself, this whole idea of B40, M40 and T20 keeps popping up, despite many people and many policymakers knowing that it is flawed to a certain degree. So I think it's really time for us to shift the conversation towards the idea that these are the metrics that we should be interested in. It's not about 20, 50, 30 or 40, 40, 20. These things can change, and it is good that they change.
Okay. All right, in the couple of minutes that we have left, I do want to ask you, you've given us so much to think about the start of the new year, and I hope policymakers take it into account. What is it that you would like policymakers to most consider in thinking about this when creating policy or tweaking current policy? Greg and Dr. Suraya, who would you like to begin with? Maybe Greg, would you like to begin first?
Okay. So in my opinion, we should just move away from the B40, M40 to T20 first towards something that is better. And I believe the government is already doing that. So it's
in the works. Okay, that's good. Dr. Suraya, your final message. What would you like to be the takeaway from your ongoing report?
So don't use these lines as the start and the end of everything, and don't equate these lines as well as B40 equates to the poor. Now the T30 equates to the wealthy. Don't do that. Understand that we are doing this by decile, and this is the current trend. And if we do it again for the next 10 years, there might be some differences. So we do need to all the time look at the decile.
Okay. Thank you so much, both of you, for your good work and for sharing your analysis and your insights. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thanks so much for watching. Good night.